Alright, ladies and gentlemen, the holidays may be over, but Nurgle is indeed the gift that keeps on giving year-round. And here we are with our Nurgle faction guide, so we're going to be breaking it down, taking a look at the strengths and weaknesses of the roster, doing a full roster breakdown, going over the army abilities and some tactics that I found to be super strong in domination mode. We'll look at the lore of magic, also talk about some builds for domination mode, so this, unlike the Khorne guide, now that we're able to talk about multiplayer, will indeed have some nice builds for you guys to jump in when the game does launch. We'll give our closing thoughts from there. So once again, thank you all for joining. Grandfather smiles on all of you today. And here we are. Let's go ahead and break down the roster. So you may be asking yourself, is Nurgle for me? Well, let's go ahead and talk about these strengths and weaknesses. I think that will be very helpful for giving you a little bit of a perspective on all of that. So firstly, the strengths of Nurgle. These bad boys are extremely tanky and have high HP. So if you're a person who really doesn't like getting your Lord sniped, or maybe you found that in Game 2 and Game 1, you were someone in multiplayer who did get your Lord sniped quite a bit, well, Nurgle is going to be a very good choice for you. Even if you have your Lord, for example, being beaten on by, let's say, 2 Bloodthirsters or 2 really powerful gooning characters, they're incredibly tanky with massive HP pools and very, very tough to take down. For example, Kugath Plaguefather, which is on Ultra Funds, of course, has 14,800 HP, and Ultra Funds is now the new standard for multiplayer, so you can kind of look at these stats and metrics through that lens. But he's got 14,800 HP, the other Great Unclean ones have 12.6, and even the Heralds themselves have close to 5,000, but really the Great Unclean ones are the super chunky boys. But overall, the entire roster is quite tanky. Even their cheaper infantry like Nurglings have a really high HP pool. The Plague Bearers have a massive HP pool as well. They don't have good armor. That's one of the weaknesses of Nurgle overall. But they make up for that by having a ton of HP and really, really good healing effects and relatively decent melee defense across the board. So another big strength of Nurgle that we just kind of talked about is the fact that Nurgle does have a ton of healing. And this is incredibly strong, right? The domination mode is an objective-based game, so having staying power on the objectives to be able to sit there and hold them in accrue points, even if you're losing many battles, having the staying power to kind of just heal through your opponent's DPS and hold those objectives is super, super big. So Nurgle has 2 big ways to heal. Number 1 is going to be the Fleshy Abundance from the lore of Nurgle, which is quite good. Number 2 is going to be Fecundity. Fecundity is your second army ability, and I would say it's one of the better army abilities in the game. It's basically like an overcasted Invocation of Nehek. It's going to be giving you a pretty big heal, and of course we'll be showing that later in the guide. So tons of healing, and several of the Nurgle units do heal. The Beast of Nurgle, for example, only costs 800 gold, and this is one of the Nurgle SEM, so single entity model is what I mean when I say that. And he passively regenerates. So getting a couple Beasts of Nurgle on an objective with a bunch of Nurglings and maybe a Great Unclean one makes it very, very tough to remove for sure. So something else that's quite unique about Nurgle is you look at Nurgle, you look at all these big chunky boys, you're like, okay, the Plague Bearers have 23 speed, the Nurglings are kind of quick at 34, I suppose. The Plague Bearers just are super slow. Their mobility, like the Plague Toads of Nurgle, only have 59 speed. But they're actually not as slow as people think. Everybody looks at Nurgle and, at least in my experience in the domination mode games, has been like, oh, I'm safe on the flanks. I don't need to worry about my flank objectives. Nurgle isn't going to get there super quick. But you can actually surprise people because Nurgle does have access to the Furies, which have 110 speed. They have the Rotflies, which are 90 speed flying units that have amazing armor piercing. So Rotflies plus Furies teaming up can really take down enemy mobility and can help you secure objectives. And then your Nurglings will eventually arrive. And Nurglings, of course, are very, very solid. And they have 34 speed poison, very, very tough to remove off objectives. Now, Nurgle, I think, is also really good because they have some of the strongest magic, I think, of all the lores of magic. Their lore is really good. It has access to healing with the Fleshy Abundance. It has Blight Boil, which is an amazing blob nuke. It has Rancid Visitations, which is like a Spirit Leech type effect. So it has healing, it has Spirit Leech, it has good AoE damage. It also has Curse of the Leper, which is quite unique. This actually reflects damage back. So if you have a Plague Bearer fighting like a Khorne monster or a Khorne warrior, it's going to be able to reflect damage back at them. And this is really, really good at turning the tides on those middle objectives. And honestly, yeah, Nurgle's magic's quite good. They also have access to Lore of Death, which is still incredibly strong. But generally, I think Lore of Nurgle is quite a bit better. The healing is just more conducive with their playstyle, in my humble opinion. On top of that, Nurgle does also have access to a Mortis Engine. Only one, the Exalted Great Unclean one, does have a Mortis Engine, making him an absolute raid boss at fighting on middle objectives. And he's also quite a bit quicker than Kugath and some of the other chunky boys with 36 speed. So again, great magic and Mortis Engine. So another strength, like I said, Nurgle's very tough to snipe. If you guys are worried about being sniped, I think that's a faction for you. Nurgle, of all the Chaos Gods, I would say Nurgle and Tzeentch probably have the best chaff units, although Slaanesh has pretty good chaff too. But Nurglings at 350, having poison, a really high HP pool, and in domination mode, Vanguard deployment is actually very important because units that have Vanguard deployment can creep up on the capture points much quicker than units that don't. So Nurglings are a really good tool for getting on the objectives quickly, and just having a big, disgusting tar pit of these little poison-causing creatures to just give your opponent some problems. The last big strength of Nurgle, in my humble opinion, is the fact that they have really, really good anti-infantry. Nurgle, of all the Chaos Gods, Khorne's pretty good at killing infantry too, but I don't think anybody can kill infantry faster than Nurgle can. And the Mortis Engine, in conjunction with the Drain, they have a ton of anti-infantry via the Plague Toads of Nurgle, and the armor-piercing Rotflies can tear through armor. I think Nurgle has some of the best anti-infantry tools in the game. The Lords are just absolute lawnmowers in terms of killing infantry, between the Mortis Engine of of the standard Plague Lord, the Exalted Great Unclean One, and Kugath being able to drop Nurglings that can detonate. I think Nurgle has some of the best anti-infantry tools in the game. And Nurgle really, really wants to be in a blob fight. If you're playing Nurgle, you want to force blob fights. That is how you win. It's very tough to beat Nurgle in a blob fight. Maybe Vampire Counts might be up to the task, but aside from that, I think it's going to be super, super tough. They have these plagues that spread and just can do so many big debuffs in conjunction with drains and just poison. It's very, very tough to drag them down. Now, on to the weaknesses of Nurgle. One of the big things is, though I said that Nurgle isn't as slow as people think, they also can be as slow. It's a little bit of a strange one. They are very slow, and if you have a very good Hawkeye and you can see when Nurgle spawns their mobility and you have good awareness on domination mode, you're going to be able to see it coming, and the rest of their troops are very predictable and ponderous, and this gives you time as the defender to spawn counters to them, which can get in possession a little bit quicker. And this leads me on to my next point, which Nurgle can be outmaneuvered very hard. For example, they can often overcommit very heavily to one objective and not have enough protection on other objectives. A Cathay player might come in with a bunch of Jade Lancers, or Kislev with, of course, their own mobility, and they can really, really hammer those flank objectives, and you're simply not quick enough to respond. So with Nurgle, you have to be very planned with how you're going to play and make sure you allocate the proper defenses to your objectives that you plan on holding. Now, probably the biggest weakness of Nurgle in my experience has been vulnerability to missiles. All of the Nurgle roster, with the exception of the Forsaken and the Soul Grinder, and I think that's pretty much it. Like, everything else has like sub 50 armor. So if you're talking like Bretonnian peasant archers, Cathay peasant archers, crossbowmen, Kossars, with just any number of range units, Nurgle is going to get pounded pretty good by those range units. And I've had a couple of games with Nurgle where I'll go up on objectives on domination mode. I'll be winning a lot of fights, but what tends to happen is I'll then be sitting there on the objective and my opponent will blast me off it, just because I'm such a potato and so slow that you can get blasted off if you're not like bringing the appropriate mobility to shut down enemy range tools. So those are kind of the summary of their weaknesses. Overall, they're relatively slow, can be outmaneuvered. They lack a good anti-large as well. Nurgle really has only like the Great Unclean Ones and maybe the Beast of Nurgle and the Rotflies to deal with large. None of them truly have dedicated anti-large. It's just something that really isn't like shining on the roster. They're more so focused on clearing out infantry, which is good because infantry carry a ton of weight in terms of the capture points on domination mode. So it's certainly strong, and I think there's a really good marriage between Nurgle and domination mode. So next up, my friends, we are going to be breaking down the roster. Let us begin by taking a look at the Godfather here. It is going to be Kugath Plaguefather. So he's certainly an interesting lord. What's cool about him is he's super meaty, and he also does have an artillery piece. So for example, if you're playing domination mode, you can put Kugath on the middle objective, and he's going to be able to use his 400 range to defend both of your objectives to an extent. Granted, he doesn't have a ton of ammo, so he can run out. But Kugath, he's got pretty good combat stats, high weapon strength. He is a decent fighter. You can put Kugath on the middle objective, and assuming he's not being shot by like 30 missile pieces, he's going to last a long time. He does have a nice AoE buff via Plaguefather's Oration. Nurgling Tide summons Nurglings, which can be blown up, and this is very good if he's surrounded by cheap spears. Virulent Contagion is a plague that spreads to up to 5 units and lowers melee defense by 40. He, of course, has access to all the lore of Nurgle, and his other cool abilities are Cloud of Flies, but more importantly, the Nurgling Infestation. So Nurglings are probably one of the better, cheaper objective holders. They carry a lot of weight in terms of capturing an objective. So if you have a lot of Nurglings around him, he is going to be healing them nonstop. He basically has like a Mortis healing engine with Nurgling Infestation. So I think it's very, very cool. Overall, I wouldn't rate Kugath as the strongest lord. I do think matchup-wise, he has a couple nice opportunities against Cathay and some of the other factions that have good ranged that are tightly packed. Not so much against Tzeentch because they're loose formation, but if you're playing against tightly packed crossbows, he can shoot them with his artillery piece from his toilet seat, and he also, of course, can bomb them with his magic. And he's a really good anchor piece on middle objectives with great healing and a ton of HP. Very, very tough to remove for sure. Now, the next lord is going to be the Exalted Great Unclean One. He has access to, of course, the same lord magic. He has Blight Swarm, which again is a debuff that spreads and lowers melee defense. But what's really nice about him is he has Pestilent Decay. So this is insanely good because it's a Mortis engine. I actually rate him higher than Kugath because the Exalted Great Unclean One has 36 movement speed, whereas Kugath has 28. So like if you need to get to the other objective or a nearby objective, the Exalted Great Great Unclean One can do it. He turns around relatively quickly, he can get there, but Kugath is like literally a potato. You need to sit him on one objective, and the Exalted Great Unclean One is a little bit more dynamic. So you have one that has access to Lore of Death as well. You have the Herald of Nurgle. Now these guys are actually really good. If you want to go with a wider army, the Heralds are awesome because they have the Rotfly mount, which is a really good armor-piercing mount, good against anti-large as well. He has the Palanquin of Nurgle, which honestly I'm not a huge fan of. It's okay. But he has Lore of Nurgle, he has Children of Nurgle, which is the passive, and I should probably go over this, but we'll have a whole separate section on the Lore of Magic. But more importantly, he has Locus of Fecundity. So he's got Fleshy Abundance, he's got Locus of Fecundity, which is a passive, not a passive, but a targeted heal, which actually heals up Vigor, and he does have the ability to fly around. So like, he can respond to threats much better. And again, one of Nurgle's big weaknesses is mobility, right? So having this flying character that can bounce from objective to objective, his magic can be in more places at once. He's a little bit of a decent combat character, so he can like alpha strike things, whereas the Great Unclean Ones are more predictable. I actually think that the Heralds are really good for Nurgle, and I expect to see them in wider style builds. And there are some matchups where you want to go wider, and the Herald of Nurgle is going to be a great choice. So those are the Lords for Nurgle. Now for the heroes, we have the Cultists of Nurgle. Pretty simple, but not a bad SEM. And by SEM, again, I mean single entity model, or a unit that has only one model in it, a hero. He has armor sundering. Nurgle doesn't have the best armor piercing across the board. None of their units in terms of infantry do have armor piercing, so mixing in a cultist isn't bad. And a lot of times in domination mode, you're going to be fighting for those like central objectives, and like Nurgle needs to win it first. Like if Nurgle's the one trying to get the objective back, I find that they really struggle. You need to win it quickly. Get on there when the 3-minute mark ticks off, you grab it and you cackle. Now, he has Gate of Nurgle, so he can summon Plague Bears. Summon units, however, do not capture objectives, but they can still help you push off enemy troops. He regenerates, he has Cloud of Flies, and he does also have increasing debuff. So the longer he's in melee, he debuffs enemy troops. So he's really actually quite good in blob fights, and you can strip him down to his base kit here and just bring the debuff and the Gate of Nurgle, and it only costs 850. So you do that with like a Herald, for example, and then you get a bunch of Nurglings in your starting force, and I think there is some teeth here to all the cultists, really. They're pretty good for winning the first objectives. But it really depends on the playstyle. In domination mode, really, there's tons of different builds you can do. You can go super elite. You can do a mobile Nurgle build using Plague Toads and Rotflies. You can go with something very simplistic and like with big chunky lords. There's tons of different ways you can play, which I think is very, very fun. So next up, we do have the Plague Ridden. Not much to say here. They have a nice little AoE buff, and they have different lores of magic, both Nurgle and Death. Don't need to talk about that too much. Honestly, not really going to be seeing Plague Riddens. I think there's not too much of a point in bringing them, simply because like all of the Nurgle lords are casters, so it's not like there's a combat lord. I think at some point though, that Creative Assembly probably will have a DLC that is going to add a combat Nurgle lord that doesn't have magic, and then these guys will be viable. But for now, I think they're somewhat useless. Infantry, Nurglings are one of the better chaff units in the game. They don't like win fights, but they don't lose fights either. They just sit on the objectives, they tank, they cost 350, but more importantly, they have Vanguard deployment. Vanguard deployment is super strong, and with Cloud of Flies, when they're engaged in melee, they actually get 9 melee defense, putting them up to melee defense in the 30s. So they could easily fight like enemy, 500 to 600, 700 infantry from your opponent's side, and they will lose eventually, but they're going to hold that objective and allow your big Nurgle monsters to do work. Next up, you have Plague Bears. They're an interesting one. I'm not a huge fan. They are relatively slow and relatively super slow. They're like corpse guards. They have 23 speed. But if you're playing a faction that kind of has to fight you in melee and isn't going to be bringing a ton of missiles to play, I think that the Plague Bearers of Nurgle can be good objective holders. They have 48 weapon strength, so they hit reasonably hard, and they do also have 30 melee attack with poison. They also have physical resist to boot, so they're very, very weak to missiles. With only 25 armor, if you have peasant archers, I don't like them so much against like Cathay, and we've obviously seen that Kislev has like Kossars, and all of their armored infantry have like guns, right? So they can shoot down your Plague Bearers. But if you're playing against an enemy that has to go and fight you in melee, let's say like Vampire Counts, these guys are super good because they're really good at playing the grind game as long as they're not being shot with missiles. So when you're using them, just think, is your opponent going to be coming in with, missiles? Do they have peasant archers? Do they have crossbowmen? Do they have archers of the Empire? Whatever. If the answer is yes, then you probably want to bring maybe Forsaken or just spam Nurglings. If the answer is no, then Plague Bears are quite good. Next up, we have the Forsaken of Nurgle. These are probably one of my favorite units, extremely fast, and you need the speed with Nurgle. They have 42 speed, they hit like trucks with 58 weapon strength, and they also have poison. And that's really, really good. These guys have been one of my biggest MVPs. They can get to the objective quickly, they can tear apart enemy infantry, they have some armor, so they're somewhat durable against missile fire. I really like them quite a bit. Next up, you have the Exalted Plague Bears. I'm really on the fence about these guys. I think having one of these guys just like maybe tanking in the middle, if you have a cheap lord, maybe bringing one could be worth it. They do have armor-piercing missile attacks. It's kind of like a flamethrower effect they use, but in my testing, it's not super strong. They obviously have pretty good stats, but really, I don't think the cost difference justifies them over the standard Plague Bears, and I think there's better options on the roster. But again, very early on in the meta, time will tell. We will see. So now onto the monsters and beasts, and this is where Nurgle really shines. They have Furies, which again, every god has different Furies with different perks. Khorne has Frenzy, Tzeentch has Protoss shields, and the Slaanesh ones have Armor Piercing, and Nurgle has Poison, and they're really good. Nurgle has very few tools for diving into the back line, and aside from like the Rotflies and the Chaos Furies and obviously the Plague Drones, you have like nothing for shutting down enemy missiles effectively. You don't have any Hound units. So Furies are probably one of the most essential elements on your roster, and Nurgle can, field really good air forces. You have Chaos Furies and you have Rotflies teaming up. You can use one of your Great Unclean ones to use the Blight Swarm or, the big Virulent Contagion to lower their melee defense, and suddenly you're going to be winning Air Force fights pretty well. So Furies are hands down one of the most essential units in the roster and are very, very good. Next up, we have the Plague Toads. Plague Toads are also a huge, huge piece for Nurgle, because if you have seen Domination Mode, you know that your spawn point is relatively far back from the center objective. Plague Toads are quite good. They have high mass, so even though they are anti-infantry and they're not super tanky, they have a big HP pool, and they can also be used to just like block up enemy cavalry to get to your objectives quickly, and they're quite good at just mowing down chaff units. Like for example, if we're looking at like enemy Hound units, enemy basic warriors of any type, like State Troopers for the Empire really is where they shine. But I always bring these in every single matchup. They're really, really good at just kind of getting there and giving you mass and bodies. So because if your opponent has a lot of mass, they can kind of, bully you, push through your ranks, but having something to dictate mass is important. Next up, we have the Beast of Nurgle. He's pretty good. For only 800 gold, you're getting an armor-piercing monster that has poison, regeneration, also, of course, has Cloud of Flies, but he has Slime Trail too, which lowers melee attack and speed. So it's nice to have one Beast of Nurgle in your army just for the Slime Trail debuff. And, Nurgle doesn't have a lot of good options for armor piercing. So, for example, if your opponent comes in with a Terracotta Sentinel, looking at the roster here, there's not like a whole lot that can actually fight it, aside from your Great Unclean ones. So, summoning in 2 Beasts of Nurgle for 1600, which costs the same as the Terracotta Sentinel, 2 Beasts of Nurgle will very easily defeat a Terracotta Sentinel in combat. They're relatively quick with 40 speed by Nurgle standards, and I like them quite a bit. Next up, we have the Rotflies. These guys are one of the better units in the roster. I think they're amazing. They are an excellent hard counter against mobility. So if your opponent is bringing in Jade Knights, or if you're seeing Winged Lancers from Kislev, for example, Armored Cavalry, these guys will get the charge on them. They have huge armor piercing. They poison them and keep them from getting away, and they can dictate speed. And honestly, one of the few dedicated armor piercing options you have, really, really good. Next up, Pox Riders and Nurgle. These guys are just an upgraded version of the Plague Toads. They basically have a dude riding on the back and slightly better stats. Personally, I don't think they're worth it. I think the basic Plague Toads for 650 are much more cost effective, because any day of the week, I would rather have a Plague Toad of Nurgle plus a Nurgling. Like, I feel like that's going to give me a lot more utility and, agency on the battlefield, whereas the Pox Riders, I don't really see the point of bringing them. But again, maybe we'll be proved wrong. Next up, we have the Spawn of Nurgle. These guys are freaking awesome. So obviously, fighting on objectives is very important, and Spawn of Nurgle are very good at that. They have Cloud of Flies, so usually Spawn are kind of squishy in melee, but these guys get plus 9 melee defense, putting them up to 37 melee defense and 36 melee attack, and poison as well. I really like this Spawn. I think it's good, and in a couple of matchups, they can be bruisers. And man, oh man, it is not pleasant to fight them on objectives. They are very, very tough to push off. Next up, we have the Plague Drones of Nurgle. And I kind of feel the same way about the Plague Drones as I do about the Pox Riders. I feel like, honestly, the extra 400 gold isn't worth it. The basic Rotflies get the job done. Maybe there's a couple matchups in which it could be worth it, but I really, really feel like the basic variants of these units are just exponentially better. And again, if you're in campaign, obviously it makes sense. You're going to bring the Plague Drones, right? They're just objectively better. And but like in terms of multiplayer where you're having to pinch your pennies and really, really be more efficient with your builds, I think the basic Rotflies are better. Next up, you have the basic Great Unclean one. So he's the standard Greater Demon here. He's got Stream of Corruption and Miasma Pestilence, 2 of the worst spells actually in the Nurgle lore. He does also heal, and he has Cloud of Flies. I really don't see much of a point of bringing the Great Unclean one, aside from like having a dedicated monster beat stick. So maybe if you have like 2 Great Unclean ones and you're expecting your opponent to come in with like big armor, like let's say a Norskin Mammoth or something heavy like that, maybe. But aside from that, I have yet to have good success with the standard Great Unclean one. I find that the Lord variants are just exponentially better. And if you're not going for the Lord variant, just go for the Herald and have a much wider army that can play the objective game better on Domination mode. On the bottom here, we do have Plague Drones of Nurgle. These guys are kind of interesting. These are the Death's Head variant, so I feel like there could be something to them. You pay 300 extra gold, but they have the Death's Head, so they can fly over you and they can shoot while moving, and they basically have these explosive armor-piercing grenades. So I kind of was theory crafting to some weird builds where you come in and you have, the Plague Drones of Nurgle teamed up with a couple Furies, for example, and, you just kind of dominate the skies and bombard your opponent's infantry and cycle charge them. I feel like a Nurgle Air Force, could be really deceivingly strong. But again, time will tell. I do think that the Plague Drones of Nurgle certainly have some teeth. when they're with the Death's Head. I don't like the other one so much just because they don't like have too much like that varies them from the Rot Flies, but these guys have a nice ranged attack, so maybe it's good. Last but not least, we do have the Soul Grinder of Nurgle. This guy is okay. I'm not a big fan of Soul Grinders in general. I feel like the Beast of Nurgle for, you know, like less than half the cost, it does the same thing and isn't that much worse in combat. But again, the Soul Grinders have 75 speed, and like I said, Nurgle doesn't have a lot of great tools for dealing with like big targets, especially big armor. So maybe the Soul Grinder of Nurgle, as the meta does develop, will be an option. Yeah, it says anti-infantry, but really, he can fight big monsters pretty well. With 42 melee attack, poison, and 450 weapon strength, he certainly doesn't mess around. So that is the Nurgle roster. Overall, I think some of the best units are the Nurglings and the Plague Toads of Nurgle in conjunction with the Mortis Center and Great Unclean One and the basic Heralds. They're all quite good, and the Rotflies, of course, get the honorable mention here. So that is the roster. Hopefully that's helpful. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we'll jump into battle and show you the army abilities and give you a breakdown of how they work. Alright, so here we are in battle against the great forces of the Changer and the army abilities. So the first one is the Curse of the Slug, and this one is a speed debuff and charge bonus debuff, and it also spreads, so it's kind of like an AoE slow, which if there's an objective being captured, you want to keep your opponent from getting there, Curse of the Slug can actually do a good job. Next up, you have Fecundity. This is a really strong one. It's basically an overcasted Invocation of Nehek. So you cast it, it spreads to your units, so you want to hit your primary target, and it's going to be spreading to everybody. And again, it further accentuates the strength of Nurgle in like blob fights. The last one is Rot, Glorious Rot, and this one is actually really, really strong. Basically, it's kind of like a big final transmutation. You cast it, it does massive AoE damage, and again, it splits to 5 targets. Now, how does Nurgle get these army abilities? It's really easy. The other gods have, relatively complicated objectives, but for Nurgle, you just have to take damage, which is great. So you send in your units, you take a beating, and you live your best life. So, we're going to be gathering the forces of the Plague God right here. We do have some Toads as well as a Beast of Nurgle who are going to be kind of creeping around the flanks, and we're going to go do some battle with the Tzeentch boys. So we're moving up across, and you guys will see how the army abilities generate, and I will do my best to generate and get all those stats going. We brought all the magic, so maybe you'll see a little bit of magic here as well, but for the most part, let's get our Toads and Beasts kind of moving around the flanks. The dreaded tactical reserves have come early. Looks like Tzeentch using a little bit of metal magic, and now they're going to be sending in their Forsaken. So we'll get the big chunky boy in there. There he goes, and get the Nurglings in there. And good. So obviously my Nurglings will take a beating, but honestly, they just ate a Forsaken charge, and you can see they've applied poison. We now have a Mortis Engine in here, and Plague Bearers will make pretty dominant work over most of these units. Nice little bombardment going down there from the AI. And as we take damage, you can see our army meter is going. So little Nurglings jumping in there. Let's get the Plague Bearers moving in, and we are living our best life. So let's have some fun as well. Let's go ahead and drop a Blight Boil here. Blight Boil is quite a cool spell. This one's going to be doing a big explosion damage, and it's very, very good on objective. So you'll notice that Tzeentch is shooting my Lord, which is, obviously relatively tough. There's the Blight Bolt. Check out the damage. It's pretty insane. Yeah, big nuke there. One of those units actually just gets purely evaporated. But I'm happy that my Lord is taking this damage, so I can show you guys the abilities a little bit quicker. So we'll do a little bit of fast forwarding here as Tzeentch continues to bombard us. We get one army ability, which is the Curse of the Slug. I can single target this, but there's not really any point of showing you. It's just a slow ability, so we don't need to worry too much about that. So we continue to grind here, and we will pull back. I'm going to let them do a little bit more damage here, and we will have the Fecundity here in a second, but I have Fleshy Abundance, so even though I'm getting nuked pretty bad, and I am on fire, which will be minimizing the rate at which I heal, it's still obviously going to be very, very good to drop a fat heal here and heal over time. So we're pulling back a little bit. We'll keep him going, and we're just going to let the Great Unclean One kind of get popped. We'll pull him out of range to see if the fire wants to come down a little bit, but I do need to let my units take a little bit more of a beating. So obviously, let's get the Great Unclean One over to this main blob here. Forsaken in combat. I'm pretty sure Plague Bearers actually win head-to-head. It depends. They'll take more damage from the charge. But again, Tzeentch does have the capability of kind of scooting and shooting here. So we're going to just gather in all of our units. Let's get the Beast of Nurgle in here as well. Keep swinging that bell. It reminds me of that like old disco song. You can ring my bell. You know the drill. Anyways, so now we're going to use Fecundity. So check this out. It's really good. I'm still on fire, so the rate of healing is going to be quite a bit slower here. But we're going to pop it, and you'll see it spread here, it spread here, it spread here. In the range, these guys are a little bit out. It can spread to a maximum of 5 units, but it's really, really good. And now our big boy is healing, and also Nurgle does have the passive to their lore that they heal when they do that, which is really, really cool. So we got a couple other neat spells like Stream of Corruption, which honestly isn't that good. I think that the Blight Blow is a little bit better, but we're doing our jam. So now we just move in, just grind these guys down, and force a pit fight, and Tzeentch will have no chance in a pit fight. We do have our big debuff here, and the Blight Swarm, which is going to be hitting some big AoE, punishment on these guys in terms of their melee defense. You can see it's spread to all of them. They're all poison. Nurgle really, really shines in the blob fights. And again, my Great Unclean One was getting like nuked the entire game. We could pop into their Fleshy Abundance if we want to, which is going to heal us. And the Big Chungus is just healing super quick. Look at his HP just skyrocket up. Nurgle is very, very tough to kill for sure. Like, I think one of the big mistakes in multiplayer is going to be trying to snipe Nurgle units. So we'll be back in just a second, and I'll show you guys Rot, Glorious Rot. All right, so here we are sacrificing our great unclean ones to the changer of ways to basically show you guys the rot glorious rot. So they've taken quite a beating here, but these chunky boys are holding on. I basically brought the hardest counter to them, which is like a bunch of flamethrower units from Tzeentch. But now that it's done, let's go ahead and pop this right here onto the blue horrors, and you will see the rot glorious rot. So it's going to have to eat through their shields, but it has hit all 3 of these units. So the shields have already been eaten from the pink horrors. They're taking damage over time. You can see the effect is going for another 10 seconds. So, like, obviously, it's not as good against Tzeentch because they can heal, but in terms of their barriers, these barriers actually have 1400 HP. So the Rot Glorious Rot has done about 1,400 damage, give or take, to all of the units in a radius of like 5 meters, which is really, really strong, actually. Like, against Tzeentch, they can regenerate their shields, but if this was a faction that didn't quite have the sustainability of Tzeentch, you would kind of get the idea of that, and it would be much stronger. So there you have it. There's Rot Glorious Rot, doing about, 1,400 damage to a group of 5 units. And it does pretty good damage against SEMs too, so it can like help, snipe characters and whatnot. But better used on these big blobs of units, as the tooltip does infer, strong against men with 50 or 25 units or above. So there you go. All right, so now we're here in the tactics section of the guide, where we're going to be going over some really basic principles with Nurgle that I think are very strong. So the first one is going to be the tank and spank, the Nurgling tank and spank to be more specific. So Nurglings obviously have pretty shit damage output. 28 weapon strength isn't the worst in the world for their price point, but basically they have a ton of HP at 8,400. They apply poison, so what you want to be doing with Nurgle is you don't want to be sending in your Plague Toads first to fight, or like your Rotflies, right? They all have low armor and aren't super tanky. 24 melee defense, and the Rotflies, they have like decent HP, and their poison does protect them, but generally, you want to either be using Nurglings or Plague Bearers to take the initial damage. And then from there, you can spank with these other units that, of course, hit relatively hard. You have the Great Unclean One following up. That's the jam. So tank and spank with Nurgle infantry. So in this case, we have a couple Khorne warriors here. We're going to go ahead and fast forward and waddle on over here. Rotflies are a great answer against some of these armored units because, man, Khorne warriors can like just absolutely demolish Nurgle units. Like, it's brutal for sure. So we're going to go ahead, jump out of here, attack these units, and get the Rotflies to come in. The Nurglings will take the initial charge, and you'll see they'll take it like champs. That way the Toads are going to be a little bit better in terms of staying power. You can also use the Curse of the Leper here, for example, on the Nurglings, which is going to reflect damage back at the armored Chaos Warriors here. Yeah, the Nurglings are taking a bit of a pounding, but that's to be expected, right? From here, you can get your Rotflies around, you can do a little bit of a rear charge. And as the fight grinds on, you're using your plagues. Like right here, we have the melee defense plague. Locust of Wrath, of course, is helping quite a bit, but their damage is actually being reflected back at them. And in these big grindy fights, they start to get worn down, they get poisoned, their melee defense is being punished. And really, the only damage we've taken, we've lost 1 Toad, no Rotflies. The Nurglings have lost maybe like 200 gold in terms of value, right? Now, looking at the Khornate troops here, they've lost more like 500 or 600, and this unit is going to be breaking soon, and then we can use our Toads to chase it down. Had I not sent in the Nurglings, the high DPS of the Chaos Warriors of Khorne would have done a ton of work. And Nurglings really just are a great meat shield unit overall. It allows the Mortis Ascension to go, it allows the Nurgle monsters to fight, and really is one of the better ways to do it, in my humble opinion. And of course, we have Fleshy Abundance. If you want to heal those adorable little guys, you can, but I would recommend in Domination mode just summoning in another Nurgling, pulling back your Toads, and rinsing and repeating. Plague Bearers do the same thing, but they're a little bit more expensive and are slower to get to the objective, so I think Nurglings are one of the better examples of that, and they do the job great. So the next thing for Nurgle that you really want to focus on is forcing blob fights. So much like the vampire counts with Mortis Engine and Raised Dead, Nurgle really shines in blob fights. And the reason why is because they have plagues that spread in a localized area. So obviously if your opponent's spread out, your plagues are going to be minimally effective. On top of that, your Mortis Engines won't be as good. You won't be able to spread poison as well. Nurgle really wants to force blob fights. So a really good way to do this in the new PvP multiplayer is to just take your back objective and just play for the middle. In this way, like if your opponent wants to overextend and go for your back objective, your reinforcement point is going to be much quicker. You'll be able to get some Plague Toads there, some Furies, and defend it well, and you force the fight onto the middle. I find that for Nurgle, going for like a back cap on someone and going for their back objectives is possible, but it's not quite as feasible. I think really you want to force blob fights and do everything you can to just get them to come in and go fisticuffs with you. Grinding with Nurgle and melee is very tough. I think that Khorne can do it relatively well, but in order to do so, they have to really use their big monsters to try and peel off your Great Unclean One. So again, force your opponent into blob fights. That really is going to be one of your big strengths. The next big tactic for Nurgle is to use your flying units and your air force to goon enemy missiles, because if you don't, Nurgle gets absolutely pounded, especially by Cathay. Cathay, if they have the yin and yang and they're just sitting there with their crossbows unleashing on your Nurgle boys, you're going to get melted super quickly. So what you need to do is use a combination of the Rotflies, Furies, and potentially the Death's Head drones if you want to, but really Rotflies and Furies, support them with your Nurgle magic and your Nurgle army abilities, and you really need to shut down those ranged tools. Also using the Nurgle magic like Blight Boil and the bombardment spells and the high mass of the Great Unclean One to push back into enemy missile lines is really essential. Use those flyers to shut down enemy missiles, and you will live long and prosper, and the Plague God will smile on you until the end of times. All right, so now we're going to be taking a look at the magic of Nurgle. So here we have the Great Exalted Chungus, and let's look at the spells of the lore of Nurgle. So they have Miasma of Pestilence. We don't need to showcase this one too much. It just lowers melee attack and charge bonus. It's okay. The best reason to use Miasma of Pestilence is if you just want to trigger your lore passive for Nurgle, which is the Children of Nurgle, which heals your character. That's really the main thing you want to do there. Next up, we have Fleshy Abundance. This is one of the better spells. It's extremely expensive, but if you do cast it, it is going to be giving you 1.6% HP per second. Very, very good. Typically, you want to save it for the sumo wrestler here. Next up, you have Blight Boil. This is an amazing ability as well. It has decent armor piercing and is really good for shutting down backline missiles. In the Chaos of Domination mode, people having to watch multiple objectives, really be aware of what's going on in the battlefield, it's much easier to slip in these spells like Blight Boil and get those big bombardments to shut down enemy missiles. Next, we have Rancid Visitations. This is basically a Spirit Leech effect. It does about 800 to 1,000 damage to the target. It's okay. Honestly, I think it's a little bit overpriced, and I think there's better spells to use, but it is a Spirit Leech, so if you need to snipe an enemy character, you use that. Curse of the Leper is a really interesting one. It's quite cheap and can trigger your passive heal, but it also gives your unit armor and reflects damage, which I think is very, very good, and we'll showcase that in a second. And next we have Stream of Corruption. So the two spells we're going to be focusing on here to show you is the Curse of the Leper, as well as the Blight Boil. Those are the ones that are really interesting, and we'll get this party started. So what we're going to start with is the Plague Bearer. So Plague Bearers have no business beating Khorne Warriors. Khorne Warriors will dominate them in combat typically, but where you have the advantage is via your magic. So what we're going to be doing is sending in the Plague Bearer in a 3v1 situation to fight these Khorne Warriors, and we'll be casting the Curse of the Leper. Now, we don't have enough to overcast it, or do we? We do. So that basically gives you more damage reflection and also gives you more armor, which will make him, very, very durable, because typically the Plague Bearers aren't super tanky, right? Now, as far as other options go, if you overcast Fleshy Abundance, we don't have enough yet, but we'll show you. Miasma Pestilence, you get extra miscast. This one does extra armor piercing damage. Blight Boil just basically hits harder, and Rancid Visitations hits harder as well. It's relatively straightforward in that regard. So here we go. We're moving in with the Plague Boys. Let's see what we can do. And we will overcast Curse of the Leper. That's the main one I wanted to show you because it's the most unique, and the other spells you guys more or less know what they do. But we're about to get into combat versus the Khorne Warriors. Let's go ahead and pop this. And now we're going to use Overcasted Curse of the Leper. It'll be going down, and you're going to see damage reflection. So normally the Plague Bearers would lose this, but with the Curse of the Leper active, they're going to be reflecting damage back at the Warriors. So they're obviously winning that trade and are also being swarmed by several units, which is super big value. Curse of the Leper has worn off at this point, but they were able to reflect quite a bit of damage. So other abilities we can try. We can just have the Plague Bearer start beating down that Herald of Khorne, and you can see they're holding pretty well. Having gotten that early lead with the Curse of the Leper, they seem to be winning the fight pretty well. We could use Blight Boil, we could use Rancid Visitations. Let's see what Overcasted Blight does. Yeah, it's not letting me click it, although we could just look at that a little bit later. Yeah, it just does increase explosion damage. But you can find a pocket of units that are a little bit bunched up like this. You drop that bad boy, and that's going to do some fat damage. Now, this one takes a long time, so it's really best to use this if you're distracting your opponent, but there you go. Pretty good damage. That was a small pocket, and this is a very armored unit. But let's go ahead and use Curse of the Leper now that they're fully surrounded. So you'll start to see damage being reflected back, additional DPS on these units. It's really good if you have one infantry unit being swarmed because the amount of value you get back in conjunction with the healing is very, very good. So those are the main elements of Nurgle's lore. They have Stream of Corruption, which is the same as the Skaven Scorch ability. Nothing too crazy, but I do think it's a very good lore of magic. It has healing, it has some really nice utility, and I'm a huge fan of Curse of the Leper under the right conditions here. So there it is. And now we are going to be moving on to some multiplayer builds. So let's get this party started and have some fun. All right, ladies and gentlemen, and now we're here with the multiplayer build guide. It's going to be Nurgle versus Tzeentch with this first build. Now, against Tzeentch, you have to be very careful with Nurgle because they have a ton of sniping on your big targets. They have the blue horrors, the pink horrors, they have the blue fire of Tzeentch spell, which does a ton of damage, and it's pretty much impossible to dodge. So in my experience in playing a lot of multiplayer games with Dav and Anticity and a lot of these guys who are here playing, is that if you bring the Great Unclean One against Tzeentch, he's going to get nuked into the Shadow Realm by all of those ranged spells and abilities, and you're going to be losing, 3,000 gold worth of your assets very early in the battle. Despite his tankiness, he can tank it for a period of time, but really, the Great Unclean One is very good against melee blobs because he has a Mortis engine, your opponent's coming in, he's really getting to use his melee prowess, but Tzeentch will often nuke you off an objective and then come up and clean you with their Forsaken and other units and their Doom Knights. So really, I highly recommend the Herald of Nurgle. He's got 90 speed on the Rotfly, he has access to Stream of Corruption, which is a very good, cheap crowd clearing spell. and of course Fleshy Abundance, which is another healing spell, because you're still going to be getting nuked, but he's much more able to dodge those attacks. He's not like a sitting target. If they have all their pink horrors shooting up at the Herald of Nurgle, you can avoid those shots relatively well. So I highly recommend the Herald of Nurgle here in this matchup. From there, we go to the Cultist. The Cultist is very good for being a roadblock. So what you do with him is you get the Chaos Steed, which makes him quick with 78 speed, and you move him up. And when your opponent is trying to push onto objectives, you use him as a roadblock by summoning the Gate of Nurgle. So the Plague Bearers come in. So summon units cannot capture objectives, and the Plague Bearers are okay at fighting on the objective. You can summon them on an objective totally to try and win it. But I often like to use this as a roadblock. So if there's like a choke point, they're trying to get on the objective, you summon the Gate of Nurgle, and the Plague Bearers come in and just like stop them in their tracks, which is very nice. On top of that, and you can also summon them on top of ranged units. So if your opponent has like a bunch of pink horrors bombarding you, boom, summon some Plague Bears on them. They'll be taken care of for, a period of time. On top of that, Forsaken are very good. Tzeentch does have a lot of really squishy range units, and Forsaken are quite excellent at flanking about. And honestly, they're somewhat durable on objectives. I mean, they only have 20 melee defense, but if you back them up with some Nurglings and a little bit of healing magic, they can do just fine. So objective holders are going to be 2 Nurglings. Don't need to say much there. They just hold objectives. And Plague Toads of Nurgle are very good because Tzeentch has an absolute ton of lightly armored ranged units that are infantry size. So the Plague Toads of Nurgle are a counter to the blue horrors, and they're very good against the pink horrors as well. They don't kill them super quickly, but generally they do a very nice job. Now for reserves, you can see it's just more of the same thing, right? We have the Pox Riders of Nurgle. The only reason I brought them instead of the Toads is because I ran out of the Toads to bring. And in general, the Toads are very good here. You can see I have 2 in reserves. I do have the Pox Riders of Nurgle, which do the same thing that we just talked about. 2 Rotflies, because Tzeentch does have some armor, not a ton, but if they bring Forsaken out, or if they bring Doom Knights or Chaos Knights, you're going to need some armor piercing. So that's why I bring the Rotflies in this build. They have good armor piercing, and they're going to be your counter against the Tzeentch armor. Now, it might even be prudent to actually cut a Forsaken and a Nurgling and get a 3rd Rotfly, but again, as the meta evolves, time will tell, and we'll make that adjustment. 1 Spawn of Nurgle, if you are able to kill their range units and they start spamming melee, bringing in a Spawn of Nurgle can actually be relatively strong. So we got 4 Furies as well, 1, 2, 3, 4. These guys are just very good at jumping on range units, giving you battlefield mobility and control, and applying poison where they need to go. More Forsaken, more Nurglings, more Toads. You guys get the picture. It's shutting down the melee-sized Tzeentch units, tar pitting them, and pushing them back using the Furies and just our sustainability. So that is our build against Tzeentch. And now we're going to be loading in and showing you our build versus Khorne. So obviously I only have a couple builds now because we can't show the other factions yet, but we will be adding those later on. So Khorne is actually a hard matchup. I would say Khorne is probably favored against Nurgle. Nurgle's interesting. Yeah, I feel like Tzeentch has a slight edge too, but like they can hang in a lot of different matchups. But yeah, this one is tricky because what happens is you need the Great Unclean One to kill Khorne infantry, okay? Khorne infantry absolutely dominate Nurgle infantry. You can sit there with your Plague Bearers and your Spawns and your Nurglings, but the way that you beat Khorne infantry and units in general is by using the Exalted Great Unclean One and your magic advantage with the Mortis Engine. But that becomes tricky because what we quickly discovered in the early builds is that Khorne can go with double Bloodthirster or like some sort of double anti-large and really just push your Great Unclean One out of the fights. Now, to counter that, what you do is you bring double Spawn. So Spawn have good mass and poison, so you just sit him with a bunch of Chaos Spawn, and it's going to make it very difficult for the big Khorne monsters to get on there. So what I like to do is leave my Plague Bearers to hold the back objective, and if they send Hounds or Furies, Plague Bearers are tanky enough that they can sit and defeat all of those guys in combat. If you leave Nurglings back there, they will get killed. So what you do is you bring the Nurglings up to the middle objective, leave the Plague Bearer in the back, get 2 Spawn of Nurgle and the Great Unclean One, go sit on the middle, and then basically summon in reinforcements based on what you need. If they bring armor, you bring Rotflies. If they bring, their own Furies, you can counter with Furies. Forsaken are just good because they're fast, and they're a good response against like the Khorne Fleshhounds and things like that. And if you need anti-SEM, so let's say they're just spamming not Defilers, I'm thinking of 40k, the Soul Grinders, you can summon in Beasts of Nurgle. Beasts of Nurgle have good armor piercing, and they can even fight Bloodthirsters okay if they have some support. They'll get wrecked horribly by a Bloodthirster one-on-one, but they're cheap, and if you back them up by the Great Unclean One and stack your healing, they can do well. A couple Toads just for a little bit more mobility. They're not really great against Khorne in my opinion, but there's a time when Nurgle doesn't have a lot of fast stuff that can hold objectives. So that's why you're seeing Forsaken and Toads here. So that's more or less the build versus Khorne. Good luck. Have fun with that one. Now, the next preset is going to be Nurgle versus Cathay. Now, this is an interesting one. I've seen this matchup go back and forth because Cathay can go monster spam against you with the Sentinels and the Dragons and really goon your stuff, or they can go mass infantry with mass bows, which is super good because that's one of the biggest weaknesses of Nurgle. So what I like to do is go for the Exalted Great Unclean One for the Mortis Engine in case they go mass infantry. Plus, he's also more mobile. He's got 36 speed and can move back and forth. to the objectives better than Kugath can. And to deal with the Terracotta Sentinels, you get the Great Unclean One plus the Beast of Nurgle. Those two will be able to defeat the Terracotta Sentinels pretty decisively, especially considering you have healing. You also have Rotflies. Rotflies are great against Cathay Infantry, Cathay range tools. They can fight the Longma Riders with Fury support. Good against Jade Lancers. They're just a great unit. So I like to start with one and a Fury, because if they do come in with Longma Riders to try and dominate the sky, you can start with these two units, provide them healing from the ground, and summon in more Rotflies and more Chaos Furies. Nurglings, of course, hold objectives, and just having one Plague Toad to chase down peasants or just flank and give you more mass is always good. Now for the reinforcements, we have the Rotflies. We got two of those. We got two Beasts of Nurgle in case they go Terracotta spam. Forsaken are really good. They dominate most of the Cathay infantry with the exception of the Celestial Dragon Guard, and I think really do have a lot of teeth in this matchup, and a couple Toads and Nurglings to flank. So these are the starting armies here. There's a bunch of different ways you can play this. Honestly, Kugath is pretty good in this matchup too, so if we want to theorycraft a little bit, Kugath Plaguefather is nice because if they do go for a bunch of range units like Crossbow Spam, which is very, very good against Nurgle because they're all lightly armored and slow, you can go with Kugath, who does have an artillery station. You sit him on the middle objective, and he's very tough to remove with a ton of HP. He can summon Nurglings, he has an AoE buff, and he also heals Nurglings with his Nurgling Infestation, which is really, really good. It's one of his passive abilities if we look down here. Where is that bad boy? Here it is. So yeah, you can totally go like a Kugath style build. You just bring like a couple of spells. I would recommend Blight Boil and Fleshy Abundance. You get a bunch of Nurglings to hold the middle objective, and then you can go for like a Rotfly Doom Legion, right? You can get a couple of these and get some Furies to back them up and one more Nurgling. So you could totally do something like this for your starting army. And then you push up with Kugath. He bombards their range units. You use the Rotflies to counter their mobility, their Jade Lancers, and their crossbows. And also, Kugath is a good enough fighter to fight a Sentinel, especially if he has some Rotfly support. And then, of course, you can summon in whatever else you need. I would say of all the matchups I've shown you today, Kugath is probably the best against Cathay. Against Khorne, the range isn't that useful, and he gets kind of beaten down and tar-pitted. Against Tzeentch, he's too big of a target, so really I think his best bet is Cathay. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed the build guide. Now we're going to be talking about my overall opinion of Nurgle and multiplayer. Now, Nurgle is pretty okay across the board against the factions you've seen, but I do think that Nurgle is not as good as Khorne. Khorne has more mobility, more gooning potential, and really just has good sustainable fighting. I think that Nurgle is obviously not going to be in the bottom rung of factions, but I do think that Nurgle is a B-tier multiplayer faction. They're really good at one thing, which is blob fights, but the problem with that is when you get to higher level multiplayer and like a higher skill ceiling, players are going to be better at avoiding you and not giving you those blob fights. Therefore, I think Nurgle is a very good faction for beginners, but I think when you get to more advanced tournament players, I feel like Nurgle is going to kind of run to a wall where they're predictable, they're slow, and if you avoid the blob fights, they're going to be very, very easy to counter. Now, that being said, Nurgle can still force these blob fights, and they're very good at sitting on objectives for sure, but what I found is that Nurgle armies tend to get killed very quickly because they have to sit on the objectives and they're a little bit slow, but they usually win on points. So that's been my really big paradigm. There hasn't been too many games with Nurgle where I've like tabled someone off, whereas with Khorne and some of these other factions I have. But I do think Nurgle is good at what it does. If you can force blob fights and really, really kind of pull the game into your style, it's very good. So yeah, I think Nurgle's a solid B. I wouldn't say they're as good as Khorne, but again, they're pretty good in multiplayer and are very, very fun to play. So, and we're early on. You could like do like some crazy builds too. So let's say you're playing Nurgle against like Cathay, right? They're expecting all these slow monsters. You could go for like a Herald of Nurgle. So let's go ahead and just do one last kind of theory craft here. So let's get the Rotfly. We want to get the Blight Boil for the bombardment. And now you can go for like just like a crazy, crazy build. You could do potentially a bunch of the drones to kind of swarm in your starting build, get a bunch of Plague Toads to swarm, and then maybe just get like two Nurglings to hold the back objective, right? So now you have like a super mobile starting Nurgle army. You could bring in your reinforcing army, you could bring like the armor-piercing plague drones, you could bring, Forsaken, and suddenly Nurgle isn't slow at all, right? Like, so there's so many things we have yet to explore. This build might actually be really good against Cathay. But yeah, a lot to explore, and this could be good against Khorne as well. I mean, you have a ton of armor-piercing and anti-infantry, like, sounds good, right? All right, that's it for now. So, the multiplayer assessment, I would again say a B. If you guys enjoyed this, please do drop a like. As much as I hate asking for that, it helps quite a bit. And let me know which guide you would like to see next. I'm going to be working on Cathay soon, and obviously as I get access to more of the factions, I will be doing guides for them. So thanks again, my friends. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you all on the other side.